That President Klaus and Ambassador Gavrilovich have joined us. So I'd like you all to welcome our guests.
Good morning. My name is David Lefkowitz. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and coordinator of the Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law program here at the University of Richmond. And it's my pleasure this morning to welcome you back for our second session of 3 speakers, the first of whom is Bruce Caldwell. Bruce Caldwell is research professor of economics at Duke University, director of the Center for the History of Political Economy. And today he'll be speaking on F.A. Hayek and the Economic Calculus, the Cambridge and Virginia lectures. Please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. And the way I'd like to set up this talk is just to talk a little bit about being an historian of economics and what we do. And what we often do is we spend a lot of time in archives. So I've been out at the Hayek archives, the Hoover Institution, a number of different times. And as you're working through the archives, you come across things that just don't fit into your understanding of the person you're looking at. So I'm working in the Hayek archives, and I come across this, okay? It's a little hand-drawn on a little piece of paper, book cover. Starts out to be the, and then he changes his mind. It's Grammar of the Economic Calculus by F.A. Hayek, 1952. It has 2 different presses as publishers. What's going on? Why would Hayek create a book cover? Obviously sometime in the early 1950s. I'm in another part of the archives, and Hayek was on the committee on social thought at the University of Chicago from 1950 to 1962, and that appointment was paid for by the Volcker Fund. And he prepared in 1955 and in 1959 memoranda on work. And in both of these, he's laying out what he's going to be doing over the next 2 or 3 years. In both of these, again, he mentions this phrase, the economic calculus. Now, one reason this is interesting is he doesn't ever use the phrase economic calculus in his published work. I mean, this is something that he's going to write a book on, but he's never mentioned before. He's mentioning it twice in the 1950s as something that he plans to do, books that will have to do with the economic calculus. Then I stumbled upon some lectures that he gave at the University of Virginia at the invitation of James Buchanan in 1961. These are lectures that I'll be talking about a little bit later in the paper. But 4 different lectures. The second lecture is titled The Economic Calculus. And it's got these figures in it. All throughout this manuscript are these little squiggles. He doesn't really label them. He has them just like this. There's no labels. They obviously are bringing him back to something that he had done before. Finally, I found the key bit, which were lectures that he gave at the University of Cambridge when LSE was evacuated to Cambridge during World War II. Lectures to undergraduates about microeconomics. By the way, he only kept 2 sets of lecture notes. This is a guy who had an extensively long academic career. One set of lecture notes were his history of thought notes, and I think the reason that he kept those was because the way he did history of thought was he'd mention a person, and then he'd have this long typed list of all the things that that person had written, little notes on what was important and what the person had written. So it was almost like a resource that he kept, I think, through time. And the other one was these intro micro lecture notes that he gave. And as it turns out, in these, he actually has these same diagrams, but he labels them, so we can figure out what's going on with the diagrams. So anyway, I was trying to figure out what this economic calculus was, and what role it played in Hayek's ideas, and why he never, given its prominence, he never wrote anything about it. And that's the story I'm going to try to tell today, try to answer those questions. And as it turns out, it all goes back to that very famous piece that he wrote that is also a rather obscure one called Economics and Knowledge. Started as a presidential address in 1936 before the London Economic Club, published in Economica in 1937. Now, this is an address that he, in retrospective accounts, always said was important. Let me just briefly quote from some of his interviews. He says, well, about the paper, "It was really the beginning of my looking at things in a new light. If you asked me, I'd say that up until that moment I was developing conventional ideas. With the 37 lecture, which is Economics of Knowledge, I started my own way of thinking." Again, and it was with a feeling of sudden illumination, sudden enlightenment, that I wrote that lecture in a certain excitement. I was aware that I was putting down things which were fairly well known in a wholly new form, and perhaps it was the most exciting moment in my career when I saw it in print. So this is an important piece for him, clearly. And it's also a difficult paper. Whenever I recommend Hayek to students, I don't recommend Economics and Knowledge, I recommend The Use of Knowledge in Society. That's the paper that is very straightforward. Economics and Knowledge is a bit tougher. So let me talk a little bit about Economics and Knowledge. He says it's about the assumptions that we make in economic models about knowledge. And he said, now when we start with an individual, it's straightforward. Equilibrium for the individual follows as a matter of logic. It's given. As long as the person has a plan, then what the person's going to do is given. But it's when knowledge is divided, when different people have different bits of knowledge and you try to coordinate that questions of equilibrium become themselves problematical. Equilibrium for society would depend on very special assumptions being made where everybody had correct foresight about what was going to be happening in the future. And his question then is, well, how do you get then from equilibrium for the individual to equilibrium for society? We ignore all of that in our standard way of thinking about it because we assume everybody has access to correct and full knowledge. So the usual approaches of economists don't shed light on this question that he called in the paper the central question of the social sciences. Anyway, in the paper he makes a division. He says you need to divide economics into, first, the pure logic of choice, that was the phrase that he used there, from empirical questions about the acquisition of knowledge about causal processes. Empirical questions about the acquisition of knowledge, questions about causal processes. So a branch of logic versus an investigation of causal processes. And then he says the thing that just, I can remember one time Vernon Smith talking to me about Hayek's article, and he said, what is he talking about there? Because he also says, in stressing the nature of the empirical propositions of which we must make use in the formal apparatus of equilibrium analysis is to serve for an explanation of the real world. I do not mean to suggest that there opens here and now a wide field for empirical research. I very much doubt about whether such investigation would teach us anything new. So there's these important empirical questions that we can't use empirical research to try to answer. Yeah, Smith read that and said, well, yeah, I'm an experimental economist. I think we can answer these questions with these sorts of methods. Why is Hayek saying that? So this was always a kind of a problematical article. Now, luckily, he actually explains what's going on in his Cambridge lectures. So the next section then, these lectures before undergraduates, LSE undergraduates who were housed at Peterhouse in Cambridge. And here he makes it crystal clear. He says, first of all, when I used the phrase pure logic of choice in 1936-37, what I prefer to use now is the economic calculus. These two things are the same thing. This is the analysis that you would use to analyze actions that follow from a coherent plan. This can be of an individual consumer, it can be a firm, it can be a community, it can be a government, it can be a state, a nation. Okay, so it's not methodological individualism, just individuals. This is something, whenever a plan is involved, this is the sort of analysis that you use. The examples that he gives to his undergraduates are says we'll look at production theory. How do you combine inputs to produce a certain level of output in the most efficient way? Consumer choice theory. He says capital theory is another example of this sort of reasoning. And in all three cases, it is premised on the idea that all the data is all given to the individual. The individual has access to all the data that he needs to make the decision. He also significantly says, actually what all this is about giving structure to means-ends relationships, okay? It shows the various ways that means-ends relationship can be structured. And he shows this diagrammatically, and here's a page from his lecture notes. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see all of the, so one means multiple ends at the very top, okay? Multiple means one end at the top. Different means different ends. So he goes through what this is trying to do, these same sorts of diagrams that I had run across in the Virginia lectures, is he's trying to talk about the various ways that can be structured. So two sets of diagrams. Then when he gets, so this was in the first term. When he gets to the Lent term, the second term, another set of notes. He says, okay, well we did all this stuff. This production theory is he never gets a capital theory. He says actually capital theory can be used here, but it's too complicated, and he's right. Lucky undergraduates. So he gets to the Lent term, and then he tries to say a little bit more about those empirical questions, the processes. And I'm going to actually quote in a little bit of length here. This is his notes that he's giving. He's reading these notes basically, I think, to the undergraduates, and he lays it out this way: in describing the decisions of an individual from the desires and knowledge presumed to be possessed by him, we were merely making explicit a conclusion implied in our assumptions. We were playing at pure logic. That's why I called it the logic of choice or the economic calculus. No questions of cause and effect arose in the sphere. The relations with which we dealt were all of that tautological character with mathematics or logic have. Now we shall, of course, still be using this technique insofar as we have to deal with any of the separate plans of different individuals. But as these plans are separate and not necessarily known to the other individuals, as soon as the people begin to act upon them, a new and different problem arises. In a multiple economy, dealings with other people will necessarily form parts of the plans of each individual. But he will not know beforehand what the other people intend to do, and will learn this only as time goes on. Every such experience he will have, if it's not precisely what he had expected, is a new datum to him. Once we assume he has learned a new fact, we can then derive his reaction from the new datum and all the other facts. But with his learning about new facts, and he actually underlines that, emphasizes it in the notes, which may possibly lead him to alter his plan, we meet for the first time a true cause, again emphasized, bringing about a change. If he learns the new fact, the rest just follows from our assumptions. But in assuming he does learn about it, we bring about in a new empirical assumption. And he goes on to say, well, how do people come to learn about these facts? And then he starts talking about competitive markets. And he says, well, again, if we look at pure, perfect competition, the sort of thing that is being, the way that it's portrayed theoretically now, that doesn't seem to capture it. And he goes on to say, it's important that from the beginning we look at competition not as a state of affairs in which everybody knows everything, but as a process by which knowledge is dispersed and acquired. How effectively this happens under different conditions we'll gradually see. And at the end of that lecture, that introductory lecture, before he then starts talking about the rest of microeconomics, he says, economics and knowledge, he says, this is the article that you should read. He tells his students, he describes it as the only original contribution to economics I have in my own opinion ever made, although even there, of course, I have no more than to make explicit what was implicit in other people's reasoning. So even back in the 40s, he's thinking this is a hugely important piece. I'm making a key distinction here. And part of the distinction has to do between the economic calculus, what he calls economic calculus, and market process. So we're getting closer to having I think a pretty reasonable understanding of what Hayek's doing here. If we think of two articles that he published in 45 and 46, he's actually getting at these points. So he raises the question in Economics and Knowledge, how do we investigate these causal processes? We're not going to investigate them through empirical studies. Well, if we think of the use of knowledge in society, he's pointing out what sorts of knowledge is important for people to have. And it's knowledge of local time and place, okay, circumstances of time and place. Not scientific knowledge, but individual market participants knowing about specifics of their own particular market. That's the knowledge that's important. The process by which we come to get that knowledge is the process of competition. So the meaning of competition, where he talks about competition as a dynamic process and not as a static equilibrium sort of theory approach. So I think he thinks that those are the two ways. They're not empirical, they're theoretical understandings of the process by which knowledge gets conveyed. Okay, so he's kind of restating for the profession what he had stated to his students in Cambridge. That would pretty much be the end of the story, except for this 1952. Yeah, so why is he going on and on about economics, about the economic calculus? He mentions it, as I said, in the memorandum in 55 and 59. When he mentions it there, he talks about writing a popular book for the scientifically trained mind. I thought this was strange. What's he talking about there? In 1960, he writes a letter to Karl Popper, and in the 59 memo, he said, well, I was thinking I'd call it the economic calculus, but now I want to call it a new look at economic theory. Well, a new look at economic theory ends up being the name of the lecture that he gives in Virginia. And here's the program from the set of lectures in the spring of 1961. He goes to the University of Virginia. Unfortunately, the flash, you can see the flash in the middle of it. It's not quite as clear as it needs to be. But you can see the second one's economic calculus. But in his letter to Karl Popper, he says, in these Virginia lectures, I'm going to try to get at the stuff that Bertalanffy was talking about in general systems theory. So he's suddenly really changing everything about the economic calculus. Just stay with me. I'm going to try to bring this around. So let's go to these lectures. Okay. The first lecture, the object of economic theory. Here he says many economic phenomena are examples of organized but undesigned complex orders. So if this sounds like the theory of complex phenomena, which he published in 1964, it is. Whole sections of this lecture actually turn up in theory of complex phenomena. Why does it turn up there where it's a general treatment instead of doing it? Yeah, I was always angry at Hayek for not giving us examples from economics about how his theory of complex phenomena would fit in. Here in this lecture, he's actually doing that, but he ends up never publishing. Interesting. Okay, so we have to answer that. So what's the best way to investigate complex phenomena? And he says microeconomics. What we do in micro may show the way. Orders are often abstract, just like the structures of economics. The best we can do is identify patterns, okay? Patterns. So that's what he says in the first half of the first lecture. And he says the role of the economic calculus is to provide an abstract description of that kind of order. But, again, crucially, it can't tell us how that order ever comes about in the world. So this is abstract structures that may exist in the world, but you can't use the structures to explain how they come about. Now, he's saying that economic theory as we know it is filled with these abstract structures, but we never are told. We say the world moves to equilibrium in each one of these cases, but he doesn't say how we get there. So this is the distinction that he's really trying to get across. To give an account of the causal mechanism is the task for empirical science. You need to have an account of where the structure comes from. Okay, so what does he do with the rest of the lecture? In the second lecture is the economic calculus. He throws up all these diagrams. I can't imagine sitting through that lecture. I mean, I read it and I just think, oh my God, this was not a successful lecture at all. Because these are not undergraduates who have to be taking the course. These people come to a public lecture. And he apologizes numerous times through the lecture, but he still does it. At the very end of this lecture, he says, now, it may seem like this has nothing to do with the world, but he said, but it's failure to understand these means-ends relationships that Otto Neurath was able to come up with ideas about socialist planning. He thought that this was a scientific, he thought his critique of socialism was based on science. And he thought that it was just a failure to have any understanding of the means-ends relationships that one would need to have in order to make decisions about a society. He said you can use this sort of reasoning to make good decisions about a plan, any kind of plan that you might have. But it assumes you have full information. It assumes you have full knowledge. And where do you get that knowledge? Well, if you don't have that process of competition behind it, you're never going to get to that point. So you can't make that kind of, this is why socialism can't work. This was his idea of it being a scientific argument against socialism. In the third lecture, he talks about other implications, and he has an extended example about technology and its use in less developed countries. And this was, he actually mentions in response to C.P. Snow. You talked about the two cultures. C.P. Snow said, in China, you could turn around what's going on in China in a very short period of time. We just need more scientists and engineers. We can either provide them from the West or the East is going to do it. Russia will do it. So, and that was his analysis. And Hayek was just saying, wait a second. If you understand these means-ends relationships, high tech is not what less developed countries need. They've had an excess of labor, and you don't need a bunch of capital that uses just a few workers. What you need to do is have capital that can be used by the factors of production that are less scarce. So he was just saying that this kind of reasoning actually, even though it's logical, has profound implications in terms of policy. And finally, the fourth one is the communication function of the market, where he again goes through the same sort of stuff that he does in use of knowledge in society and competition as a discovery procedure. So what kind of conclusions might we draw from this? First of all, I for many years taught introductory and intermediate micro, and we had these diagrams, and it was clear. That's right; these are logical tools. A lot of them are. How do you talk about it to the students? How do you make sense to the students? And I always had a hard time doing that. I mean, I said, okay, these are diagrams, but they're trying to capture processes that occur in the world if everything worked out, and you're in the long run. I usually do short run versus long run or something like that. But he's providing a different way of thinking about it that I actually think might be kind of fertile. I don't know. I'd be interested in what other people who teach microeconomics might have some thoughts about. Now, why did he never publish it? Well, look at these diagrams. Okay? You can't be, you're talking about the state of economic theory in the early 60s, and he's doing this stuff. It's not rigorous economics. And I'm sure in giving these lectures, he's saying, well, I'm not going to be able to convince economists about this. So maybe I'll just talk about theory of complex phenomena in more general terms and not talk about economics quite so much. Now, the bit that I think, by the way, he was also depressed when he was giving these lectures. So I don't know if he was depressed because he realized about the lecture independently. I don't know what was going on, but we know he's severely depressed, almost suicidal at this point. And then he came out of it. And he claimed it was because he started smoking his pipe again. That he came out of it. But then there's another bit that makes this actually more intriguing. He's thinking about this book cover, right, that I gave at first, right at the same time that the Century Order comes out. And if you take a look at also some diagrams that he has in a 1954-5 paper that was never published again, about systems within systems. He's got these diagrams, again, turned on their side. Okay? So this would be, for capital theory, lots of means to produce these particular ends that are then used in a process of production that goes through time. Through time. And you can also think of this hierarchical structure of neuronal connections that he uses to describe how the mind works as being analogous to capital theory. Steve Horowitz has actually written a little bit about how similar his writings on capital theory and his writings on the sensory order, two really disparate sorts of subjects, in fact, are both talking about structured hierarchies that are flexible to adjust, but they also have a certain permanence. So I think that the reason that he would have a book cover of economic calculus, a grammar of economic calculus, is not because he was thinking, okay, I'm going to do a popular book. You don't make a book cover of something that's a popular book. I think he was thinking these ideas are actually ways to bring together lots of disparate phenomena, that there's lots of complex phenomena that operate under the same sorts of conditions, and what we do when we study them is we examine their structure, but then we need something else to talk about how they change, how change takes place. And we can think of analogies going into the evolutionary theory of his later work as well. I will just mention, in the mid-60s, he actually organized something called an analogy symposium that took place in Bellagio, Italy, where he brought people from lots of different fields and he was saying, look, I think there's a lot of ideas that are taking place in different fields that we can put together. Finally, remember he gave his lecture in 1961 at the invitation of Jim Buchanan. In 1962, Buchanan and Tulloch published Calculus of Consent. Calculus of Consent. Now that's an interesting title. And here's the cover from the original edition. What are those little markings on there? That's on there. What's going on with that? Maybe it has nothing to do with Hayek's lecture, but it looks an awful lot like this. I mean, who knows what's going on there? So I'll just leave you with that thought. Perhaps some questions.
Well, I'll just ask the obvious one. You never asked Jim about the cover?
No.
Maybe ask Gordon.
Yeah, I found out about the cover from George Vanberg, Victor Vanberg's son. He and I were presenting in January, just around the same time that Jim died. So I was talking about Austrian economics. He was talking about public choice theory to undergraduates at ISI, Liberty Fund, IHS, his name. And I saw this cover, and he said, in talking about this, he says, and I said, gee whiz, where? So Jim was dead. He actually emailed Gordon or called Gordon. Gordon couldn't remember where the cover design came from. I'm going to go up to the Buchanan house and see if I can find the paperwork that had to do with the publication of this, and also at University of Michigan Press, they may have some stuff that's left, but unfortunately, I found out about it just as he was passing. So. Okay, thank you.
No one was willing to say you got hired.
I forgot my glasses in my hotel room, so in order to get the paper closer to my eyes, I have them huddled up. I borrowed from the library. Thank you. Sorry, Emily.
Very good. So our second speaker in the session this morning is Emily Skarbek. Emily is lecturer at King's College London, and this morning she'll be speaking on F.A. Hayek and the early foundations of spontaneous order. So please join me in welcoming Emily Skarbek.
So I'm going to try to draw out some connections. I think there will be a lot of connections and walk a line between Peter's paper and address some of the areas that Jerry had discussed and hopefully make a few connections here. So The title's a bit ambiguous, but hopefully we'll get on with it. I'm very excited to be here, by the way, and I wanted to thank Sandy and thank David, although he's not here, for having me. And I also just wanted to also make a note that I did this paper while I was spent last year at the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University, and so I was really appreciative to have the time to be able to work on that while I was there. And so I'll kind of do an overview of how I'm situating this idea within Hayek's intellectual tradition, his body of work, and then I'll say a little bit more. So Hayek generally understood the project of the economist as a social scientist to be about understanding the social world within a context of a set of institutions, both formal and informal. And he started out his early intellectual career focusing on the contextual nature of knowledge and how the role of the price system worked in communicating and transmitting this dispersed knowledge. And in examining how individuals with dispersed and discrete knowledge faced incentives in the market to exchange with one another and bring about this high degree of complex social coordination. And so his earlier period of work focused a lot on the order that emerged within these sets of institutions. And we notice a marked change as Hayek moves out of technical economics and moves into doing his work on looking at the foundational institutions that give rise to these orders and kind of pushing these ideas out further into examining what are the foundations in which these orders emerge. So in doing so, Hayek's later work became increasingly evolutionary, and we've heard a little bit about that already. But this intellectual trajectory is quite complex, and there's a lot going on here in a number of different margins. For the purposes of my article, what I wanted to focus on was Hayek's awareness of and the importance of the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, and in particular, Hayek's own views of Mandeville and Smith in shaping the inquiry into social order. Okay? So I wanted to kind of briefly sketch this out. I know we've talked about it in a number of different ways, but Hayek, he had earlier written on scientism and the study of science. And when he gets to individualism, true and false, he starts to address these foundations of the intellectualism true tradition of Mandeville, Hume, Tucker, Ferguson, and Smith, and compares that to the individualism false of the French rationalist tradition, the origin of which comes, the main idea being this idea that if society is to progress, that it must progress by social institutions which are rationally designed. And this is obviously a very big theme in Hayek's work. Okay? So a lot of these ideas constituted what was comprised of the abuse of reason project that he ultimately abandoned, and, well, abandoned it as a project in and of itself, but it took many forms in how it actually came out. The Constitution of Liberty, at the same time, and eventually these ideas developed into law, legislation, and liberty. Okay? So what was Hayek concerned with, in particular with relationship to this way of exploring the social world that was coming from the 18th and 19th centuries? In Hayek's very earlier work on this, he said, look, what we had going on in the 18th and 19th centuries was the study of economic and social phenomena guided by a choice of its methods in the main nature of the problems that it had to face. So people who were interested in understanding the social world, in particular Smith and Mandeville, were guided by how they were going to go about doing that by the types of questions that they were looking at. So the questions were dictating the methods which they used to explore. And he says, look, it gradually developed into a technique that was appropriate to these problems without much reflection on the character of their methods or the relation of those methods to other disciplines. And so he said, look, the term science had not yet assumed this special narrow technical meaning, and this developed into his ideas about scientism and the disastrous consequences that scientism has had in the first half of the 19th century and then moving forward. So Hayek became very concerned with this neglect of the spontaneous order, the neglect of spontaneous order theorizing moving forward. And he did so conceptually, methodologically, and the scope of inquiry. And so this is important because as Hayek's moving out of the narrow technical economics and into working at the Committee on Social Thought, he's taking on different types of projects, he's going to be addressing these things. And I think that the relationship between the conceptual and the methodological is very important, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so in the problem of the method of the social sciences, Hayek states that the danger now is of scientism impeding on the understanding of society. Okay? And he wasn't alone in kind of sharing this concern. Buchanan was very blunt about calling the profession out in how we go about understanding the social world. Okay? And specifically calling for a return to the types of inquiry that were present during when Smith was asking this question. So a renewed focus on the exchange behavior of individuals and the context in which that exchange takes place. Okay, so what I tried to do in this paper is kind of sketch out these three areas. I wanted to first detail the relationship between Hayek's later work on the evolutionary nature of robust institutions and the conceptual roots of these ideas as Hayek saw them in Mandeville and Smith. So Mandeville is central to Hayek's view on the development of spontaneous order theory for his place in the history of ideas. Smith was very central, in my view, to Hayek in his execution and his ability to elucidate these processes of spontaneous order in the way in which he did it. And so second, I want to discuss the methodological connections between the early spontaneous order theorists and Hayek's later work on the evolution of institutions. And here, while Sandy was nervous because she's talking in front of Bruce about Hayek, I can be doubly nervous because I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology as well. So finally, I want to conclude by discussing some of the ways in which these ideas are relevant and very important for how we understand the scope of the profession today and what that means in terms of political economy more broadly. So when I look conceptually, I'm going to look at Hayek's view of Mandeville and Smith. The paper moves on to consider specifically the use of conjectural histories in looking at the evolution of institutions. And then, again, addressing the scope of inquiry. So, in Individuals and True and False, Hayek attributes the discovery of the twin ideas of evolution and spontaneous order to Mandeville. And much of what we know about Hayek's thought on Mandeville comes from a lecture that he gave in 1966 to the British Academy that was specifically on Mandeville. It was the lecture on a mastermind, as he called him. And he was very careful to call him not a mastermind of economics and dismiss his economics. He was very dismissive of Mandeville's economics. But he maintained a very important contribution that Mandeville had made in making this discovery. And I think it's important to revisit it. He said, look, what Mandeville did was to set up, to break a habit of thought that had been so persistent up until Mandeville's time. It's this habit of thought that was coming out of, that was pervasive of the time. And so he was saying, look, Mandeville's main contention came to be that we have these complex orders of society, the result of human action but not of human design. and that they're very different from what the individuals involved intended, and that these individuals, in pursuing their own ends, whether selfish or altruistic, produced useful results for others that they did not anticipate or even know. Okay? So the contributions of Mandeville was first to identify the twin ideas of evolution and spontaneous order, to recognize that these patterns of social order were unintended outcomes of purposive action, and then to mainly to extend this idea about these twin ideas of evolution and spontaneous order to other areas of society as a general theory of social order. Okay? So to law and morals, to language, the market, money, changes in technical knowledge, and that it was this application to society at large in these larger areas that stood out. So Hayek credited Mandeville with creating a conceptual space for positive theories of spontaneous order. And in Hayek's view, in the history of ideas, from the Greeks to the Spanish Jesuits, they all came remarkably close to accurately characterizing spontaneous order, but they all suffered from the persistence of what he called this false dichotomy. And this false dichotomy was to attribute the characteristic of natural to those processes that were independent of human will, and to attribute the characteristic of artificial to those processes that were of deliberate human design. Now, what Hayek said is, he said, look, this led to terrible confusion in that some thinkers would be describing the same social institution that had the same properties of a spontaneous order institution, and one would describe it as natural because it was not deliberately designed. The other would describe it as artificial because it was the result of human action. And so Hayek is very impressed by this distinction, and I think that that's very telling, because when we go to look at why it is, what Hayek takes from Smith, we can start to maybe see why he might have ignored TMS for the obvious reasons that, you know, a lot of people ignored it at the time. But there's also the idea that you can't quite read Smith without being hit over the head with this natural and artificial distinction about these processes. And I think there was something very unique about the way in which Hayek thought that this was an important distinction. So the distinction that he raises with regard to Mandeville is what then persists in his distinction on rules and orders when he then goes and applies it in law, legislation, and liberty. So we don't know the extent to which he thought Smith fell into this trap, but it's definitely something that you see in Smith that you don't see in Mandeville. So that brings me to this idea about method and the role of conjectural histories in describing spontaneous orders as they're applied to institutions. So, what are conjectural histories? These are typical or general statements of processes by which such conjectures are based on the principles of man's nature and the circumstances of the environment that he faces. So, conjectural histories were used by both Smith and Mandeville, and they were characteristic of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers in general. Ferguson makes extensive use of conjectural histories in trying to explain these orderly processes, as does Hume in very different ways, actually. But conjectural histories were generally rational choice explanations about the micro-origins of the development of these complex institutional systems, specifically with motivationally complex characters. So I think this speaks a little bit to understanding, well, I'll leave that later. So they were comparative origin stories about grown institutions. They tried to tackle these processes of evolution and spontaneous order as applied to rules of norms. And both Mandeville and Smith made extensive use of them to specifically to engage in comparative institutional analysis. In the paper, I provide a lot of examples from Smith. There's some fantastic ones in his lectures on jurisprudence where he's doing essentially comparative institutional analysis across these different societies and showing first how these rules develop and then how they change the nature of the orders that emerge. And so the subject of these inquiries were general processes of social order, something that was very important to what Hayek was trying to get at. So essentially what they did was traced out the general steps of how institutions emerged by beginning with these first simple efforts of man in the state of nature. Scottish philosophers often wrote as if all of these beginnings happened in antiquity, and some of them are quite charming. But they proceeded by spelling out what the nature of the mechanism would have to be in order to generate the institution. And I think that there's some very important points about methodologically why Hayek would have found that very attractive. And in particular, in relationship to kind of his own intellectual history of coming to study economics after reading Menger's Principles, where Menger himself also makes use of many of these conjectural histories, especially for the origin of the institution of money. And so the idea here, if I could kind of bring it together, is that beginning with his essay on scientism and the study of science, Hayek introduced this methodological idea that explanations of complex phenomena are often limited to explanations of the principle. And this is an idea that persists and changes and evolves over the course of his intellectual idea. And I think Bruce has kind of alluded to a lot of these questions that it raises as Hayek wrestles with the methodological limitations of economics in studying these evolutionary processes. By the time he comes to work on law, legislation, and liberty, he adopts the use of conjectural histories to start talking about these processes of micro, to use Gary's distinction, the micro evolutionary processes underlying the rules that get selected and the transmission of norms. And so I think it's interesting because in terms of pulling this together in thinking about Hayek's view about the scope of political economy, really, is that the questions, that he was interested in, the idea was that the question should dictate the method by which we go about looking at the social world, and that the appropriate task of the social science is then to understand the social world, the institutional foundations of society, and the complex relationship between these two. And what this leads to is a very broad idea about what falls under the scope of inquiry, both methodologically, in terms of the way in which we approach social questions, but also in order to kind of deal with this relationship, we have to deal with the interaction between the institutions and the orders that emerge. And so I try to detail out some of the specifics of what was attractive about the use of the mechanisms of conjectural histories to try to understand these processes for which we don't have, and the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers certainly did not have access to any kind of data that could support their, could substantiate their claims. And just kind of close with this idea that the scope of the political economy is the scope of the subject matter is informed by both this conceptual idea about what spontaneous order studies are about, and then how the appropriate task and methodology to go ahead and look at these issues. So there's a lot of questions that this raises for me in terms of kind of where to go from here, but I will go ahead and close with that. All right.
Yeah, okay, so I just want to give an example that might resonate with what I think you're arguing, might resonate with some work you've done earlier. But let me know if this is off track. So textbooks in economics typically treat what are broadly considered to be economic phenomena in a sort of institution-free way. So Samuelson, for instance, will have that diagram that looks like a PPC or a difference curve, depending on what we're talking about. And as Hayek is going through his career and thinking about this, Samuelson is saying we can use that analysis to look at the growth in the United States and also to look at growth in the Soviet Union. And it's fine to do that, to use the same model for those two different circumstances. Whereas Halbrenner will say, and maybe he's more in the Hayekian line, which is odd, given the politics involved. But Halbrenner will say we could use this mechanism to look at a market-based economy in the United States, but we can't use it to look at the Soviet Union because we're not on a production possibility frontier, because there's all sorts of rent-seeking and so on going on. There are lines, that people stand in order to get goods. Thinking of what you're saying here, the question, economic growth in the Soviet Union versus growth in the United States, was answered very differently by two economists who have different views of whether the question should dictate the appropriate methods. Maybe that makes sense. Or is it sort of an example of what you're getting at?
Yeah, so what I'm getting at is this idea that what would a return to political economy look like for Hayek?
Yeah.
And I think part of that story is something that is actually quite, there's a lot of things that were quite shocking about, Hayek's work, and they continue to kind of ripple. But one of those is what it means to methodologically do work, and what are some of the accepted methods of doing work in political economy. And what I wanted to put forth is that one of these is this, bare bones idea about how we understand spontaneous orders in the evolution of rules and norms and these types of things, and that what Hayek saw, what Hayek could have seen when he went back and looked at Smith and Mandeville, was a very general mechanism for understanding these processes over long periods of time. And that general mechanism was what has come to kind of be the analytical narrative of how it is that you take a particular micro-process-based mechanistic account of how we get the evolution of these institutions, and then supply that with a rich history of the particulars of the contextual nature. So to answer your question, I think what it gets at is that we need this, logic of choice. We need this theory to go out and then do these rich analyses to understand what the particulars of the institutions and how that's impacting the orders that we see. And so what I tried to get at in the end is that I think that there is a renewed interest in the widening of economics. There's a renewed interest in political economy. There's, if you look around, you can see it kind of popping up in many different places. And much of that comes with this method of taking the logic of choice and applying it in very specific contexts.
So my point then is just that the Hayek you're describing sounds much like Halbrenner, which I find quite interesting because Halbrenner is a man of the left, very much so, and Hayek is quite different.
Also an institutionalist, though.
Yes,
So, I mean,
yes.
that's something
There
that
is
is-
this confluence, yeah. Very interesting.
I was really interested in your comments on conjectural history, because I always try to figure out what conjectural histories do. And I thought I heard you say, and I might just be wrong, but they tell us like what the institutions or mechanisms had to be.
No.
And I thought that just
No.
sort of, oh, good, because they're
Yeah.
more like, one is there sort of possibility proofs, or one is that they're running models to show it could have happened this way. But then they always seem to me, the only thing they show is that it didn't have to be planned. But it doesn't, they don't really show much about what the mechanisms were or how they were. So what do you think?
Some are, there's better and worse.
what was the big one?
There's better and worse in Smith too, within his own work. But essentially, they are like these possibility proofs about how it is that we could run through a micro foundation's understanding of how these spontaneous orders emerge, and then it's a matter of coherence within its own account, which is not without many limitations. I mean, it's not at all saying that this is the gold standard. What I am saying is that they were incredibly useful for getting at the particular questions that Hayek continually was moving towards, I think, in terms of advancing his own knowledge about spontaneous orders. And when we see a lot of the new work that's being done on actually describing how particular institutions have emerged, they have a very similar structure to the way in which they go about answering those questions.
So how do we distinguish conjectural history from a just so story?
So I try to kind of spend a little bit more time in the paper spelling out what actually constitutes a conjectural history, but I think it's again, it's the rational choice, as if as if all of your agents are purposive, not maximizers. And so I do think that, while the profession made a turn towards kind of rooting out sympathy, I'm not so sure that Hayek's characters were I'm pretty sure that they weren't as narrow as at least his contemporaries at the time, and that by leaving them as purposive and keeping everything in the means ends framework, he was very much keeping very motivationally complex characters in his stories. So I don't know. I'm sorry. So to distinguish between just so stories and that, I think it's the coherence of the logic of choice that can be compared and judged against other accounts of the same similar processes that can give you a standard by which you can compare the relative merits of your conjectural history that you don't get in a just so story. Or a just so story would be one of those that falls flat.
Okay, please join me in thanking. All right. Our final speaker in the session this morning is Chris Martin. Chris is currently John Marshall Visiting Research Fellow, but soon he will be Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma. He will be speaking today on Hayek and the, I'm afraid to, sorry, I'm mispronouncing it. Nomothetes, I think. Nomothetes. Please join me in welcoming Chris Martin.
Well, I'd like to begin just by thanking Gary and Terry for the opportunity to speak to this very distinguished group of scholars and practitioners. I am quite nervous though, because I'm very aware that I'm the only force intermediating between you and lunch. And so like a wise military rear guard, I'll hold my position only as long as it's necessary. But the second reason that I'm nervous is that I'm not really sure how to categorize my talk. I suppose for occupational licensing reasons, I should call it constitutional political economy. I'm not really sure. And in particular, I make an appeal in the discussion to some concepts and institutions from ancient Greece. But unfortunately, I was improperly educated. I do not speak Greek or classical Greek. And so I ask for your sort of forgiveness in advance if I unintentionally mangle any Attic Greek terms. So specifically, I would like to discuss the model national constitution that Hayek provides near the end of his Political Order of Free People. This constitution has found seemingly no real admirers and many harsh critics, and it seems to have fallen stillborn from the press, as Hume might have said. But we can't really dismiss this constitution as an afterthought to Hayek's political economy. He himself seemed to view it as the climax of the volume, or maybe even the entire Law, Legislation, and Liberty series. He said that the work leads up to a proposal to alter the basic structure of democratic government, which clearly seems to refer to the model constitution, or at least to its fundamental rationales or principles. And these were two in my reading. First, Hayek famously believed that freedom could be preserved if law was written in a particular way, it had particular formal properties, chief among which was generality. And secondly, and this I think is a little less appreciated, Hayek sought to insulate the production of the law itself in the special sense of rules that were coercively binding on everyone, to isolate that process from the dynamics of party or factional politics. These two goals led to the structure of Hayek's constitution, which, just as a thumbnail for now, included a constitution with a basic clause that defined the nature of a just law, that Hayek thought could be enforced by a constitutional court. And then secondly, an unusual functional division between two representative bodies, one of which would be devoted to the creation of law proper, and one of which would be devoted to the day-to-day task of government. Hayek explicitly identified precedent for at least the second of these practices was the ancient Athenian city-state. And accordingly, although he blandly named his proposed upper house, which handled the creation of law, the legislative assembly, he called its members Nomothetes in a direct echo of the 4th and 5th centuries before Common Era. But Hayek's attitude towards Athens was complex. Even though he obviously admired some Athenian institutions, he also blamed the city's eventual political failure, as he saw it, on democratic excess. But this historical interpretation, found both in the Constitution of Liberty and in Law, Legislation of Liberty, I believe is pretty clearly flawed, even to non-classicists. This is more than an obscure curiosity, because I think Hayek overlooked some key features of actual Athenian practice that could have allowed him to solve or achieve his second goal in a more satisfactory way, in a way that was be more resistant to some of the criticisms later leveled at his constitution. So, in other words, I think that the criticism that has fallen on his idea of law seems, at least to a layperson, a non-legal philosopher, to have been successful and not answerable. But in sort of the firestorm over that issue, Hayek's second goal, concerning factional politics, has received less attention. So I think if Hayek's model constitution is to have any continuing interest for us, it has to be for this second reason, and that here Hayek could maybe turn to rescue towards the Athenian precedents that he perhaps only incompletely investigated. So I'd like to just very briefly proceed as follows. I would like to outline the rationale and the structure of the Constitution in just a bit more depth. Very briefly pass over the principal criticisms of it. Then to delve into history and sort of suggest the elements of Athenian practice that I think are relevant for Hayek's objectives. And then finally make a kind of speculative argument about the properties of these Athenian practices that I think are somewhat appealing. So Hayek's first rationale is pretty widely known. It's not necessary for me to go into it to a great deal. He thought that the existence of rules of law that were general were at least necessary, and sometimes he seemed to speak as if they were sufficient to guarantee liberty. So he believed that liberty could be defined as the absence of coercion, and he had sort of a tortured relationship with the definition of coercion that he tried to lay out at various times to make a person independent of manipulation by another. And so sometimes he would say incautious things such as this from the Constitution of Liberty. When we obey laws in the sense of general abstract rules laid down irrespective of their application to us, we are not subject to another man's will and are therefore free. And similarly, he said that freedom can never mean more than that men's actions are restricted only by general rules. This didn't mean that Hayek thought the state could not coerce people. He recognized that this had to happen at the very least to prevent as a police power, to prevent others, individuals from coercing ordinary citizens, and also to obtain resources for collective action. But he thought that the presence of generality in the law could at least deprive coercion of the worst pain or the worst discomfort to citizens. He even thought that if rules were impersonally applied, coercion, military conscription, and taxation could be deprived largely of their evil nature. I've experienced evil nature here since it's almost April 15th. It still felt pretty bad to me. But as I said, this criticism is this aspect of his slide is pretty well known. The second, I think, is less appreciated, and this has to do with Hayek's appreciation of factions and what factional politics can do to law. He argues that by its very nature, the bargaining process that gives rise to parliamentary majorities or congressional majorities never fully reflects the preferences of every single individual, with the result that participants in the political system will frequently, or need always, be content with supporting a lesser evil. And this may be unavoidable when decisions are being taken about the allocation of resources, where there may be no possible answer that could satisfy everyone. But the partisan generation of the law itself, in Hayek's special sense of a set of commands that will be enforced on people by coercion, has the toxic result that the resulting enforceable rules of just conduct reflect no one's opinion about what is just. The political majority ends up in a situation where they're guided not by what they believe is right, but what has been necessary for them in the bargaining game of politics. So again, I hope you'll forgive me to quote Hayek at some length. He says in The Political Order of Free People that as individuals, we have learned to accept that in pursuing our aims, we're limited by established rules of just conduct. But when we vote as members of a body that has power to alter these rules, we do not similarly feel restrained. So when we enter the political arena, voters will often claim for themselves benefits of a kind they know are being granted to others, which they know cannot be granted universally, and which they would perhaps prefer not to see granted to anyone at all. Majorities will prove measures of a kind which, if they were to ask to vote on the principle, they would probably prohibit once and for all. So voters have become trapped in a kind of coordination problem. They're not able to vote on the principle to stand permanently, but they're forced to make these ad hoc arrangements with the result that they can't achieve the principle and they're trapped in a suboptimal situation. So Hayek's constitutional project aims to provide an escape from this trap by removing law from the factional arena and create a political space where votes on principles can be taken and be binding. So how does this work? And here I would like to refer you to my non-PowerPoint here, the robust PowerPoint. So the Hayekian model constitution, I have just a very crude sketch on the first page. So Hayek imagined a structure to try to carry out these rationales. Most importantly, he sought to separate the creation and revision of the rules of just conduct from the task of the direction or current government, or as he put it, the issuance of instructions to govern. And he argued that there was an analytical distinction between these two tasks, even though in modern democracies we call both types of directions legislation. Hayek wanted to put the direction of day-to-day affairs in the hands of a governmental assembly, which is essentially identical to the House of Commons or Congress or any elected representative assembly in a modern democracy. He knew that this assembly would be dominated by party politics, but that was fine. He thought inevitable when these kinds of decisions were being taken. The unique part of the Constitution, though, was the legislative assembly. This body would have ultimate control over the enforceable rules of just conduct, including, interestingly, the rules for the apportionment of the tax burden, although not the actual size of the tax burden. And he had a particularly strange method of election for this body. The Nomothetes is what he calls them, would be elected not by the body of voters as a whole, but by the cohorts of voters who reached the age of 45 in any given calendar year. And he suggests further that this method of election might be made even more indirect by having local clubs of people turning 45 elect representatives to a regional body, which would then elect representatives to the National Legislative Assembly. So there's an enormous amount of insulation in this process from the will of the voters. But that was deliberate. What Hayek wanted to achieve with this system was the creation of a body of people who would not be tempted to engage in factional politics. They would be the great and the wise and the good. They would not have to run for re-election. They would serve for 15 years and then retire and get sort of light honorific duties and a pension forever. So they're essentially like judges. And the hope is they will not be politicized, and they'll instead make decisions about the law that are based on considered views of what is right. Obviously, for this system to exist, there has to be a constitutional court to adjudicate the boundaries between these two bodies. So Hayek introduces one that would make sure there was no conflict in which the governmental assembly would claim jurisdiction over a certain matter, and there would be a constitutional crisis or a standoff with the legislative assembly. In addition, the constitutional court was supposed to prevent the legislative assembly itself from passing unjust laws. And so Hayek introduces into his constitution a definition of a just law, or at least notes towards a definition, which is quite convoluted and basically requires that laws not be aimed at particular purposes and that they be general in application. They not be designed to target a specific individual or a specific group. So this provision has been heavily criticized, and I'm sure people in this room are probably pretty familiar with this, so I'll just summarize it briefly. The idea is that Hayek's generality requirement can't carry the freight that he puts on it. You could imagine that a law could be passed that doesn't mention any specific individual, but pretty clearly is targeted towards one person. So Southerners who happen to be speaking in the Jepson School at 12 a.m. wearing a dark suit must follow certain procedures. And so it can target particular individuals and confer discriminatory privileges even without violating the formal requirement of universality. Hayek has some responses to this, but in the back and forth, I think he's unable to successfully defend himself against this charge. And so, as at least, again, this is above my pay grade, but I think from the outside at least, he's unable to defend his claims about the law. There are other criticisms, though, that are more salient for his argument about factions. Really only two. First, one identified by Norman Berry, who asked, I think very appropriately, why Hayek believes that his legislative assembly will be safely insulated from factional politics. Just because people have pensions doesn't mean they might not have sympathies or some other kind of engagement with particular groups in society, and they would be able to then subvert the law and serve their particular interests, even if perhaps unconsciously, due to some class interest, gender interest, race interest, or some sort of subconscious assumptions they have about society. There's also a fear that the mere mechanism of the Constitution, in which the governmental assembly has the power of the purse, could result in the politicians being able to strangle the legislative assembly and make them execute their will. I guess I would like to add one criticism of my own that I'm not sure has than particularly elsewhere. If you have a system of indirect election, as Hayek does, it seems possible that a minority, a racial minority or religious minority, could be effectively shut out of Hayek's legislative assembly, especially if it was a 12% population across the country. They would be eliminated at both the first and second levels of election and have no representation at all in Hayek's legislative assembly. So you can imagine the damage that something like that might have done in the civil rights movement or some kind of similar reform era. So there's problems with how Hayek has set this up. So for defense then, I'd like to change gears and move to Hayek's Athenian sources. Again, his explicit precedent and models for his ideas about the Constitution. After he introduces the idea of giving legislative responsibility to a body distinct from the body entrusted with its tasks of government, Hayek says that the Athenians attempted, quote, something like this by allowing only the Nomothetes, the distinct body, to change the fundamental nomos, or law. And he uses the term nomos consistently when he means the higher law, the enforceable law of just conduct. And similarly, when Hayek talks about splitting the directions of government into the higher law and sort of day-to-day commands of the governmental assembly, he has an Athenian precedent there as well. Although it's unclear if he's fully aware of this. The Athenians also had a distinction between laws and what they call decrees. And this is on the non-PowerPoint on the back page, this little chart here. Their definition was a little bit different from Hayek's. What they called a law was a decision taken in the affairs of the city-state without limit of duration, whereas a decree was a decision taken in the affairs of the state with limited duration. But functionally, it seemed to be pretty similar. So the decision to spend some money to launch some galleys to go fight a rival, that was a decree that could be taken by the Athenian citizen assembly, just a direct democracy out there on the hill of meeting. They would take a vote, and that would be that. Laws, though, were governed by a different process, at least after a certain stage of Athenian political evolution. Hayek, though, doesn't really give the Athenians a whole lot of credit about this, or at least he doesn't give the Athenian democracy much credit. He says that the Athenian democracy is an example of a general trend that democracies have, to have a glorious first period followed by democratic excess. He continues that early in the democracy, the nomos is respected, but that subsequently the masses demand the right to decide anything by majority vote and then destroy the rule of law. And he explicitly says that something like this happened in Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. He refers to the degenerate democracy of Plato's time, which would be the later 5th and 4th century before Common Era, as one in which individual liberty in the modern sense probably did not exist, in contrast to the Athens of 40 years earlier, at the time of Pericles, when Thucydides described Athens as the freest of free countries, in which everyone had unfettered discretion to live as they pleased. And Hayek approvingly quotes Thucydides here. But I just want to briefly suggest that Hayek's historical narrative is confused. He implies that the Athenians obeyed the rule of law, and then they sort of declined from there as a result of radical majoritarianism. This argument is half correct, but to see the part that's wrong, we only have to investigate Hayek's use of Lord Acton's statement that, quote, in this way, the emancipated people of Athens became a tyrant, referring to a particularly infamous trial near the end of the Peloponnesian War. But the very next paragraph in Acton's book hints that something of note happened after this that Hayek ignores. Quote, the Athenians, wearied and despondent, confessed the true cause of their ruin. They understood that for liberty, justice, and equal laws, it was as necessary that democracy should restrain itself as it had been that they should restrain the oligarchy. The laws were reduced to a code, and no act of the sovereign assembly was valid with which they might be found to disagree. Between the sacred lines of the Constitution, which were to remain inviolate, and the decrees which met from time to time the needs and notions of the day, a broad distinction was drawn. So Hayek, whether out of haste or just he overlooked it, he didn't explore the implications of Acton's statement. But in fact, the very distinction between laws and decrees on which Hayek put so much weight, and the very institution of a separate nomothetic body, only evolved due to the travails of the democracy, and it evolved closer to the end of Athens' existence as an independent city-state rather than at the beginning. So the Athenians had sort of a tortured experience near the end of the Peloponnesian War. They suffered military defeat, and they suffered 2 oligarchic coups. After the first coup, there was a restoration of democracy that was followed essentially by revenge, expropriation of property, expulsion of political enemies. It was a messy restoration, and that was the democracy that did the things that Hayek and Acton refer to as this stain on democratic honor. But after Athens' final defeat, after the siege of Athens and their surrender to Sparta and its allies, the Athenians suffered even worse oligarchic dominion under the infamous 30 Tyrants, kind of the worst possible experiment oligarchy in which people were being judicially murdered, property was being expropriated, resident aliens being expelled, a completely lawless period. The Democrats were able to restore themselves a second time, but in this instance, having learned from the past, they committed themselves to a different line of conduct. They didn't take revenge upon the restoration of democracy. They had almost not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but they had a kind of agreement not to take revenge. And they went about codifying their laws and actually writing them down and introducing now in their constitution the distinction between the nomus and these lesser degrees of the assembly. So it was after what Hayek thought was the ruin of democracy that they actually implemented most fully the ideas that he would seem to find congenial. And I know I need to conserve time here, so I'm just going to sketch in the broadest detail what these reforms were, with the caveat that this is all based on the work of actual classical scholars, so I'm just engaging in a carry trade. The Athenians had, of course, their popular assembly. This is where every citizen could meet and vote. But they also had an institution called the People's Court. Not the 1980s television series, but it was actually a series of courts that were filled by jurymen who were volunteers and who swore a particular oath to obey the law and not oppress Athenians or expropriate their property. These jurors would be selected. There was a large pool of them, about 6,000 at any given time. And when a need arose for a trial, whether civil or criminal, they would draw the needed number of jurors by random lot from the amount of people that were available. So the jury was not known in advance. What happened in this period of reform after 403 BCE was that this method of the court, selected by the lot, became deployed for constitutional purposes. So in addition to trying a criminal case, you could actually try a law or decree before a body of these jurors. In this case, they would be called a Nomothete. They would enter a different role. They would become law judges or lawgivers. And so you would actually argue the case for a law just as if you would argue a civil or criminal case. There would be a certain number of people who were appointed to argue for it, and a certain number of people arguing against it, depending on the situation. The Athenians also had methods by which laws or decrees could be challenged before a body of Nomothetes. So if you felt that a decree of the assembly was in violation with a higher law, you could bring a motion against it called graphi paranoma. Hayek does cite this, but he doesn't explore it in great detail. If your case, your suit before the Nomothetes was successful, the person who proposed the unlawful decree could be punished if only a year had elapsed since the decree was passed, or at the very least, the decree would be made null and void. If you, as a politician, oppose too many unconstitutional decrees, you could be expelled from the state. So there was this built-in sort of cost to doing things outside the boundaries of constitutional practice. After 403, the Athenians also introduced an analogous procedure called the graphu nomon, which allowed a law itself to be challenged is inconsistent with an existing law. So there was this process by which the Constitution itself, in a sense, could be made consistent with itself. And those suits could be brought by anyone. There was no need necessarily to get permission of the Assembly to bring a question like this to the floor. So let me just suggest very briefly and abstractly why I think this Athenian practice has a lot to offer for Hayek's constitutional project. And now I'm going to refer to the sort of cryptic diagram here at the bottom of the handout. It says control of factions by sortition. Just sort of very crudely, you can imagine that there are two parties in the state, the X's and the Y's, that have opposed interest and a lot of enmity. And you can also imagine a sort of crude measure of legal decisions and policy decisions, theta, that reflects the extent to which the decision is biased towards one group or the other. So a low value of theta would mean the decision is biased towards the Y's. You're giving a lot of government offices to them. When they enter in lawsuits against the X's, they tend to win despite the evidence. And then conversely for the X's. And again, sort of very arbitrarily, you could imagine that theta star represents some sort of ideal of the rule of law, that you're going to follow procedures, you're not going to give any preference to either group. Now, if everyone were sort of meeting behind the veil of ignorance, I guess, to decide where they would want theta to be situated, the democracy would probably decide on a value close to theta star, just because of the median voter theorem, depending on the size of the parties. But there's an interesting complication that's introduced when factional politics exists. The factions will be able to engage, perhaps, in internal decision-making. They're going to choose their position first before they enter the assembly to take a vote. And we know that this happened in the case of the decision to launch the Sicilian expedition. Thucydides tells us that there were people who were opposed to that decision, but they were intimidated because of the strength of the opposition, and that there was a bunch of sort of rabble-rousing demagogues walking around the floor of the assembly. And you can imagine that this is plausible if you are actually standing within the mass of supporters of a bill and you're going to have to vote openly to oppose them. You might fear for your personal safety, or at the very least, you're going to lose some friends over it. So the result, though, of this internal decision-making is that the theta value that the state expresses through its decisions could fluctuate wildly based on which party is in power. So if Y has a majority and they're able to discipline their members to vote along with the internal party decision, then our policy outcomes will be way over to the left. If X then gains the majority, there's going to be an enormous shift. There's going to be wide fluctuation. And at any given time, if it's appropriate to speak in those terms, a lot of the population will be suffering injustice from the law. The power of the Athenian institutions, though, becomes apparent in this kind of crude model. The fact that Nomothetes are going to exercise a check on laws or decrees allows for an escape from internal factional decision-making. If a decree is passed that is biased, it can be appealed immediately to a nomothetic body that is selected by lot. So you don't know in advance who's going to be in it, but because of the law of large numbers, and these juries are huge, in some cases up to 2,500 people, the probability is extremely small that there's going to be any significant difference in the jury from the overall population. Also, and this is critical, the votes in these bodies, after all the arguments were heard, were done in a kind of a unique way. Each juror would have a little ball in each hand, the fist closed around it. And as they exited the assembly area, there were two urns to which they could drop their balls. One was a valid vote, one was a negative. You would just drop it in these two urns as you passed, so no one could know how you voted. With the result that you can't be subjected to pressure, and you can't really effectively be bribed. Or I should say you can be bribed, but it won't do you any good because no one can verify that the bribe was successful. And the Athenians were very aware that this anonymity was quite valuable for them, because they complained that the 30 tyrants abrogated this procedure. especially for criminal trials. When they tried imprisoned Democratic partisans in 404, it was said that the 30 were seated on the benches where the presiding magistrate sat. 2 tables were set before them, and the vote had to be deposited not in urns, but openly on these tables. The condemning vote on the further one, and on the other side, the vote for acquittal. So what possible chance of escape had any of the accused? So in other words, it was recognized that the anonymity of the vote was critical for getting people to use their independent judgment rather than to be steamrolled. It may not be too far-fetched to see in the simple story of the X's and Y's, not only dynamics in the millennia-old Athenian assembly, but also perhaps internal party discipline in Great Britain, or the polarization produced by the American system of primaries in congressional races. So I think that Hayek might have found this procedure appealing. It would escape from some of the criticisms made of his convoluted model constitution. Instead of there having to be a constitutional court policing the jurisdiction of 2 standing representative bodies, one could imagine doing just what the Athenians did, which was to issue a basic law that said, decrees shall not conflict with the law. So the boundaries between the 2 levels of order in society would be set by the ongoing decisions of the Nomothetes. There would be no need for any kind of independent judgment. Also, it would be much easier to change the rules of the game in response to alterations in conditions. Although a simple majority vote to change the fundamental law sounds sort of like a light and trivial way to change the numbers, it actually could have some advantages. Prohibition, for example, was passed at a moment when the strength of the prohibition forces had reached a temporary high, and they knew that the influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were going to rapidly erode the electoral support they needed to lock their desires into the Constitution. And as a result, prohibition in America lasted a lot longer than it quote-unquote had to, at least according to majority opinion. So the ability to move things in and out of the wall space could be advantageous from that perspective. And then perhaps a final Hayekian reason to urge Hayek to consider this system is that it may not be clear what types of rules should be constitutionalized. Hayek tried, in effect, in advance to foresee that with his idea of a basic clause. But the Athenian system was flexible. The rules of the game and the decisions within the game could be adjudicated and adjusted based on the changing constitutional sentiment of the people. And this arguably is more consistent with Hayek's own ideas of a slow evolution of thought, an accumulation of knowledge and wisdom about political experience. So thank you very much. I hope this has been somewhat interesting and provocative, a bit offbeat, so thanks for your attention.
I really like that. It's so interesting. I'm not a Hayek scholar at all. When was Hayek writing this constitutional model? Around what time period was he writing?
This is the late 70s.
Oh, so I wonder, what did he have to say about France? Because France has a constitutional council that has somewhat the same function of what he's proposing. So Parliament would make a law, and then they would pass it, and then once passed, before it became a law, people could challenge it to the Constitutional Council. So to make sure that the decree was compatible with the law more broadly. And at the time, it was really controversial in the 60s in France because people thought that the council was being used as a tool of the executive, but it was much more nonpartisan at least than. So I wonder if Hayek, at the time he was writing this, had any kind of opinions on that, because I think it was Charles de Gaulle was the president then or something, and people were very, it was controversial how the Constitutional Council was working, but that was roughly the system, and still is, which was that decrees shall not conflict with the law as approved by the, just what you were saying. So I know
That's
it was
interesting.
floating around at the time.
I didn't know about that facet of French constitutional practice, and I'm not sure if Hayek was either. I don't know of any mention of that in his writings. I guess I would want to look into it more closely because it may be the case that it's not quite the same system if there is sort of a fixed constitutional body of rules to which, yes, appeal or challenge can be made, but it's not easy to change the body of law. So it seems to me that the Athenian system is a bit more flexible in that
Yeah.
respect, but that's a fascinating suggestion which I'll look into.
I'll just add a quick remark about Smith. So you didn't mention Smith, but to just draw it back to the conversation we had earlier today, Smith writes a lot on factions, sees factions and factionalized decision-making as, the chief threat to democratic institutions. And for him, the key problem is that factions corrupt sympathy. And so they lead to partiality and so on. I don't know if Hayek has any, I don't really think he writes about his sympathy in the same way. But it might be interesting to just think about that point a little bit.
I'm not sure how Hayek would respond, but he might say something to the effect that sympathy could certainly be a poison in the system, because you associate yourself with your particular interest group, and so you're willing to sort of throw other groups under the bus for your own advantage and protectionist legislation or whatever you imagine. I wonder if the other side of the coin is true too, whether an enlightened or broad sympathy is enough to resist those temptations. And I guess, because I am a card-carrying economist, I would have to say that incentives might trump sympathy. That if you're in a coordination game where you can't escape the level of the rules, sympathy and education and sort of a broad enlightened approach to politics might not be enough to restrain this dynamic.
Yeah, and that's really into it. Yes.
Yeah.
On Hayek's notion of the legislative assembly and the age qualification for the voters,
45 years old.
45, there are two predecessors that come to mind, and I had no idea whether Hayek drew on either. One was James Mill, who proposed 40 on the grounds of maturity, and everybody below 40's interest would be covered by those who were 40 and above. The other was Edward Bellamy, socialist, who would have everybody retiring from work at the age of 45, at which point they would achieve some degree of not only maturity, but impartiality, because they would not be quite so bound to their economic interests. Is there any sense that Hayek is drawing on either of these people or anybody else in particular, and how he came up with 45? He was beyond 45 himself at that point.
I'm reaching for a joke about early retirement and Greek history and things like that. I'm not aware of any specific link to James Mill or Bellamy. Hayek quotes John Stuart Mill and Philip, I believe, Hunton, who was a 17th century sort of opponent of absolute monarchy. Those are the people he views as having sort of foreseen this idea of the Nomothetes. But Hunton, I followed his reference, and it's nothing. It's not explaining what it is. John Stuart Mill has this conception of a legislative council that would help Parliament to draft law, but it's nowhere near as strong, even as what Jess is saying about the French Constitution. It's just sort of an advisory body that can submit things for up or down vote. So that is the element of its strength. But I don't know. That's fascinating about Mill and Bellamy. There is something about this idea of retired people as being less subject to interest, although that does not seem to be true. Once you introduce the national pension plans, that goes out the window, I think.
Just a little footnote to that. Aristotle, when he's analyzing in rhetoric, he divides people into three classes: the young, who are idealistic but fickle, so you can't trust them; the old, who are cautious but very self-interested and avaricious. That would fit the current thing. But the people in their prime, which is about 50, which coincides with roughly Hayek's age, that's when they've got judgment and they're mature and they can make decent decisions. And that's it's such a strange proposal it has, and so untimely. But that's one
Well, if I can.
Historical economist.
Yes. I'll just add one sort of additional odd feature of it. He has this discussion of how the people who elect the Nomothetes will form themselves into clubs to discuss public affairs. And he says that women may well wish to join clubs composed of men a year or two older than themselves. It's
Ever hopeful that I
yes, it's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, well, my question would be, of course, if I would make the same argument for the same institutional setting in the here and now, which is described by aging median voters, for example, and especially here to address the issue, the main issue of my comment. This is basically only, these are some prudential arguments for a certain institutional arrangement that should be put in place to drive back a certain issue, what he criticizes, which is the revitalization of the society by interest groups. So the question would be, in the here and now, is there any other possibility how to force and drive back this influence? Which would be, of course, maybe, due to the research of the last 30 years, elements of direct democracy, for example, which has been contributed from the public choice environment. So therefore, my issue would be, is this proposal by Hayek still something which could be taken today as to be considered in front of all these new findings as to be a valid alternative in the search for a good political constitution?
Right, that's a great question. And I think probably I should try to strengthen my flank with respect to what you just said. Maybe just my off-the-cuff response, though, would be that even if you're able to use, plebiscites or direct voting through the internet or something, there might be a diminishing of wall rolling because it's harder, transaction costs are higher to build these sort of exchanges and coalitions. But the problem still remains that there's this coordination game issue, that you're still tempted to vote, I would imagine, for special favors for yourself or your group, because you're not able to restrict your votes just to principle. So there might still be an advantage to having some kind of conceptual separation between the two types of law. But I would like to speak more with you about this because I think I need to expand that part of the argument.
Well, actually, we have a couple minutes, so I'm going to ask a question.
Okay, sure.
I'm having difficulty tracking the difference between law and, I forget the other term.
Decrees.
Decrees.
Yeah.
So I got one characteristic that was supposed to distinguish them, and that was that decrees could be sunsets or they were time specific or something like that, where I assume laws then were not. But it's very unclear to me how that distinction is supposed to address anything else that's being taken up by Hayek's proposal or the challenges that the Athenians were engaging with. It's real hard for me to see how what the principal basis is going to be for distinguishing laws which are unproblematic because they're universal and perhaps have some other traits, and decrees which are problematic per se, but they're a different kind of elements. Maybe that's the part of the Constitution, of Hayek's proposed Constitution, which he tries to spell that out. So maybe you could tell me.
Well, no, I think actually, and again, I'm not a philosopher of law, so this is probably a bit off, but my understanding is that what you say is that's the correct line of argument. That means that you can't write a definition that solves that issue as you just stated. That there is no consistent way that you can define what's going to be the good law and the correct boundary between laws and decrees. So Hayek tries to do it in this kind of tortured definition, but it just doesn't hold water. So the magic then of the Athenian system, to my mind, is not so much that you have even this conceptual, kind of crude conceptual distinction here, but the mere fact of having these two levels of consideration, one of which is anonymized and immunized against log rolling, allows you to access the general constitutional sentiment of the people and require decisions to be taken based on a principled position, not on a temporary partisan position. So the beauty of it, I think, is the flexibility that boundary doesn't have to be drawn in advance and defended by a Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, but it can just be generated practically by the series of decisions made by these people's juries over time.
So actually, then we could have all decisions being made as long as we have the right process, which would have to be anonymized and perhaps have other kinds of barriers to lawful and other dangers of factions.
I would have to think about that, because Hayek seems to believe that there are some class of decisions that you need to have the law rolling. There's just decisions about where to build a road. You just can't pick a general abstract, generally acceptable rule that there is none. There has to be some winners and losers. So for that purpose, you need to have ordinary politics. And you need ordinary politics so that there could be a responsible executive who's executing the machinery of government. But the exact division between those types of decisions and the higher law, I personally think is hard to know. It's hard to optimize just in the abstract. And so it would be nice if we could design a system that allows us to learn from experience and adapt to changing conditions and adapt our the percentage of our decisions that are constitutionalized over time as need and experience shows.
Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was very helpful and very thought-provoking. What it provoked in me is I'm sitting here thinking about, interestingly enough, Madison and Lincoln, okay? Because in one sense, the problem, as you stated, is trying to conceptualize a distinction between a law as a general permanent rule that's somehow distinct from a decree which is temporary, and you use the phrase partial, which is part of what got me thinking about Madison. And ultimately, what's interesting to me is that Madison thought through a lot of these same issues and came to radically different conclusions. For example, there's this wonderful discussion where he talks about the way in which it's precisely the clash of interests that introduces into legislative arenas a discussion of justice. Because what begins with an assertion of this is what my constituents want, which is then met by somebody saying, but my constituents want something else, then leads to the rejoinder, well, here's why my constituents ought to get what they want. So you justify the interests that you're asserting. So he has a very complex and kind of interesting notion about the way in which a legislative debate, which begins with an assertion of raw interests, can rise to a discussion, at least imperfectly, of principles of justice and invoke it in a way that's far less artificial than this kind of notion of, well, we'll imagine that we can have interest-free or totally disinterested decision makers in one arena and interested decision makers in another. Because it kind of dismisses that as you're never going to find disinterested people. You know, are they 45 or are they 50? Are they old or young? You know, who is really out there disinterested? Right? He's kind of skeptical that anybody exists. The other thing is, quite frankly, we also, and this is where Lincoln comes in, because in a considerable sort of way, what Lincoln and Madison share in terms of their understanding of how you prevent the worst excesses of factional behavior is a dynamic understanding on the part of any existing majority that it is not permanent. And it cannot be. That, you know, in a legislative forum, you need to be careful what you do to the minority today, because tomorrow you're going to be in the minority, and they're going to do it back to you. And in that sense, there's a kind of a cautionary dynamic built into, you know, once you take your nice little diagram and kind of understand that those two groups, X and Y, are not permanent and fixed. Particularly, and this may be, Madison sees this in a way that Europeans typically don't, because the old argument is we're devoid of a feudal heritage here largely. So you don't have the kind of fixed classes of, party X representing the landed interest, party Y representing the laboring interest. And so the majorities, particularly, if it's a truly commercial society that's dynamic, and we think about the way in which a commercial society will lead to a very high rate of change, particularly in interests, right? Anybody in any one of those existing parties today is going to at least have the thought that I might be a majority today, but it's not likely that majority is going to be permanent, and therefore I need to be careful how far I press my interests and how far I offend notions of, commonly held notions of justice.
Well, I'm cognizant that we're almost out of time, but I will perhaps foolhardily take Madison's name in vain here a little bit. And I think the flaw in that argument, frankly, is that the process of discussion and of reconciliation of views doesn't have to result in unanimity. It only has to result in 51%. And so that does allow the cost of the decision to be shifted onto the losing 49%. So, I mean, that's just kind of a brief rejoinder, maybe the first part of his argument. And then as far as the time argument, I think maybe that does work when there's a sort of a mature, long-range constitutional culture in a country. But the other way of thinking about it is let's get ours while we can, because we know that we shoes on the end of the foot. So, and interestingly, Madison actually talks about Athens as, I'm sure many people know, and he dismisses. He said direct democracy admits of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. So I guess maybe my tweak here is to say, actually, maybe it does. Maybe. I'm not sure what the practical implication of any of this is, but it seems to be something that has fallen out of the discussion a little bit, and it's worth bringing back into this Hayekian door. So thank you very much.
All right, we adjourn now for lunch, I gather, until 2 o'clock when we'll have our next session.